Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. Now to our show. Well, some of you may have heard in some of my episodes my lament that goes like this. Where are all the fresh new thinkers about leading and managing and getting things done through people, by people? We need the fresh, forward-thinking minds preparing the way for our students. No more lament. In the last couple of episodes that I recorded with academics, actually, who are very young, I have found such thinking. In this case, Martin Gutmann, Lucerne University in Switzerland, who is a historian teaching in a business school about leading, managing, and why organizations do what they do. And he has written a wonderful book called Unseen Leaders. An historian helps business students, prospective business leaders, appreciate where the real leading can happen while they're being drawn to give credit to the loudest and most assertive in the group. So I'm stealing the whole thunder of this wonderful conversation badly. So why don't I just turn you to the conversation with Martin Gutmann, my new friend and my new hero, Martin Gutmann. Oh, folks, I love this work. For a retired guy, there's nothing that makes me happier than meeting terrific people, which I have done now for well over 200 times. And this is one that I've been looking forward to because there are a couple of moments when Martin Gutmann couldn't meet the obligation. There was illness in the family and in him. And so finally, when I saw him a moment ago, just before I started recording, in his home, and he's looking great. It worked out, Martin. It worked out. We're talking. And for those of you who will, please read his LinkedIn profile. You'll see that he's a professor, but also a very, very intriguing author of a book called Hidden Leadership.
The Unseen Leader.
See how I do my homework? The Unseen Leader, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But here, I want to take a play on that word unseen because it's about practice and overall, and it's about your practice. So, what has moved you, Martin, to want to pull away a curtain or whatever else seems to have obscured people practicing leadership by surprise? Wow. What moved you into that insight and then made you want to write a book about it?
Well, first I have to acknowledge how excited I am to be on your podcast. I've also looked forward to it. And I'm glad to see that my illnesses and other absences actually just created more suspense on your end. So
it did. It piqued my
fantastic.
It peaked.
That was great. That was not my intention, but I'll take it. That sounds great. So I teach at a small business school in Switzerland. Before that, I taught at a bigger business school. So I've been in various management faculties for over 10 years now. By training, however, I'm a historian. I got my PhD in history at Syracuse University in the US. And, as soon as I started working in this business school environment, I was very pleased to note that many people use historical examples in all aspects of life. People in companies, discuss how things used to be, whether as an argument for changing them now or doing more of the same.
Mm-hmm.
But also management scholars, you know, often draw on historical case studies, communicating like Churchill or leading like JFK. And, it's it's an, I think it's an effective way to kind of make people understand and relate to something by a biographical story from the past that everybody loves and can kind of think along with.
Mm-hmm.
However, what I noticed was that sometimes, not obviously not always, but sometimes when management writers look to historical examples in the past for leadership, they don't always single out the same people that professional historians single out as having been the most influential or the most effective.
Yep.
And so I thought this is something I would love to look into more, given my, very, it's a privileged position, but it's also a great position to be a historian. So I have a slightly different background, but in this business school context. So I tried
Yeah.
to make the most of that and write a book about it.
I thought almost immediately of my own daughter-in-law, whose doctoral dissertation and subsequent book was a study of the women behind the Cuban Revolution. It would be a profound example because of the sort of the outsized Castro and all the
Yeah.
manly men around him,
Yep.
and yet talking to her, and then reading her book, there would have been no Castro, and the women who did the behind the scenes organizing and propping up and covering over because they wanted the revolution, really made the difference. Now, Linda's Closel's book has not hit the best time, but a bestseller list. But it was very thoughtful, and she went and actually interviewed the women. Now, most of them probably have passed away because that was about 20 years ago. But is that sort of the thing that your historical perspective helped you see?
Yes, that's a wonderful example, by the way, that I was not aware of personally, but um, you know, I can imagine right away that that's the case. That very often usually it's men, very loud, very brash, who love to give big speeches. Looking back on history, we tend to think, well, those were the guys who really made a difference.
Yep.
And very often, you also used the terminology that I like a lot as well. This kind of behind the scenes organizing. Very often, that's what it takes to make a real difference
Mm-hmm.
in these complex challenges that we have faced as humans in various times, whether it's in fighting a war or a revolution or leading a company through a disruptive time. And that's not to say that, being able to give a good speech is a bad thing or sometimes not necessary. So, one of the characters that I look at in the book is Churchill. And he has obviously not been overlooked. In many ways, he's not an unseen leader. Many
Mm-hmm.
people credit him for good reason with being, one of the primary architects of the Allied victory in the war. However, what I would say is his speeches were more of a nice to have on top, but they didn't win the war. What
Yeah.
won the war was his absolute mastery of the British administration and his very deliberate, very calculated, and long term campaign to pull the US into the war in Europe.
Yeah.
That's what won the war. The speeches are great, but if speeches won wars, then Hitler and Mussolini would have won because they were pretty darn good at that as well.
Yeah. Well, I should say I know a lot more about Churchill as someone in my age and status, but I know enough to know that he spent a lot of time in the bureaucracy. Uh, and learned from his context, learned what worked and what didn't. And there weren't many who reached that kind of public exposure who had slaved their way through, particularly the British system. But we have a couple of examples here in our history too of people who first did the do and then later on wrote the speech. Soldiers, we call them soldiers of the higher education. So
Yeah.
in our world, academe, you're at Lucerne University. Lucerne, it used to be honored that you went through the chairs, meaning you came in as what we call an instructor here, as you know, then assistant professor, and then associate professor, full professor. And eventually you might have become a dean or a provost or a president. That trend has moved away from us, unfortunately, from my perspective. As someone who worked in the field, if you will, as a going through those ranks, that I learned a hell of a lot about what made that university tick.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
when someone came in from another sector and didn't really have a perspective on that and didn't want to listen to it, made a lot of unnecessary mistakes. So in a way, I'm claiming that we professors tend to be unseen leaders too.
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly. And interestingly, there's another book that came out at about the same time as mine. So this was last year by Amanda Goodall, who is a leadership scholar based in the UK. Her book's called Credible. And essentially, her argument, she's not a historian, she looks at organizations that are led by subject matter experts. So
Yeah,
hospitals led by doctors who have real
actual
clinical
doctors.
practice, actual
Yeah.
doctors, exactly. Universities led by actual academics, NBA teams led by or managed by coaches who were all stars themselves.
Mhm.
And by any metric, they outperform the ones who are led by these, managers who have lots of experience managing different things and think, well, managing a basketball team is the same as a hospital or wherever else.
Sure, sure. Just
And so
people, equipment,
exactly, I'll give some,
timetables. What's the big deal?
exactly. No, so I think that is, it's an insight that I came to through my work as a historian, but it's definitely not one that I'm the first to claim or to highlight. It's just the context within which I did it. I think is one that is unique because it combines history with our perspective on leadership today. And I do feel the need to highlight again that I don't mean to suggest that these more action oriented and brash elements don't have a role to play. If you are, you know, if your house is on fire or the equivalent in your organization, that's not the right time to be deliberate and think about it. You got to get moving, call the fire department. So there's a time and place for that.
Yeah.
However, the person who only has that move might appear to us in hindsight as having been the most effective leader because wherever we look, we see them shouting around. They were always leading from the front, always making noise. But that in and of itself is not a testament to their leadership.
What I'm curious about in that sense then is why do people provide the impetus of leadership without even the chance of celebrity or advancement as far as being picked for being the prime person? In other words, they just led because they cared about moving forward, perhaps for themselves. They felt stuck unless they got others to go with them. But what did you learn about the leaders who are unseen and probably would remain so?
I think what motivates an individual to lead is going to be different in every case.
Sure.
I think some people really believe in their personal mission or the mission of their organization, and whether or not they get credit for that is secondary to them.
Yes.
I think other people, like let's let's stick with Churchill since we started with him. He was very much a public figure. He enjoyed being a public figure. So at least a part of his motivation, if we can call it that, was to be perceived as a leader. He identified himself with Britain and its empire, and he was also involved in all kinds of nasty sides of the British Empire, we have to say. Um, so the motivation can differ, and that's just one side of the equation. I think the unseen bit, in my mind, relates more to the fact that the actual work that truly effective leaders do remains or is more likely to remain unseen. So in the
Yeah.
case of a Churchill, he's not unseen, but we focus on his speeches, on his hounding his generals to go on the offensive, etc. And we overlook this more deliberate, behind the scenes, long term work that he does that facilitates success. And then we have other leaders. One example that I look at in the book is Roald Amundsen, who
Mm-hmm.
was, by any measure, the most successful polar explorer to have ever lived. He achieved all four of the major polar goals, the North and the South Pole, the Northeast and the Northwest Passage. Three of them he was the first person to accomplish. He's consistently been overlooked um, in favor of Shackleton.
Shackleton, yeah.
Exactly, Shackleton and Scott and these British explorers.
Mm.
And I think in his case, if we look at his diaries and his writings, this upset him on a superficial level, but deep down, he wasn't in it for the glory. He loved the exploring. And interestingly, when you compare him to these much more famous but less successful British explorers, you get the sense that all of them enjoyed being back in London talking about the hardships of the polar world more than they did being there. And with him, you have the other way around, that he put up with the hassles of fundraising and going to dinners when he was in Oslo or London or New York. But really, he was the happiest when he was actually doing the exploring. And I think that also tells us a little bit about why he was so much more successful, because he
Yeah.
really lived for this environment. So that
Yeah.
was his motivation.
Yeah. See, I can wick off of that with this notion that as a teacher, all those years, it seems to me now in retrospect that what I was asking my students to think about themselves, is that they were seekers in the best sense of the word, that they would have much more fun discovering than repeating that which has already been identified and put to use. Now, that was my expectation of kids who were paying their way through school by working two jobs, and some of them had families. And if you looked at this demographic of a regional state university, you'd say these aren't the cream of the crop people. They never give them the basics and get them out there to run a McDonald's franchise at best. I never bought that and never will, ever. It certainly wasn't me growing up. I mean, if people would have said, he doesn't belong. So we've always had this sort of elitism when it comes to uh, in sort of engendering something with kids as they go forward. But as you just gave that example, if they could find something that it so deeply intrigued them that they'd never end their curiosity in regard to how things work in this regard, whether it's a sport or I just wanted them to understand that the real fun of life is just what we're doing right now, learning things with each other about stuff we didn't otherwise know. And so I'm hammering on this a little bit with you, Martin, because you are still a teacher, and you've said that your study has found that the unseen leaders are by and large self-motivated, self-directed, and willing to take risks with themselves and sometimes on behalf of others, and without necessarily getting the PR but getting immense satisfaction.
Absolutely. And I think this is, I suspect these days among leadership scholars, this isn't a terribly controversial statement to make. The fact that to be a leader, you have to have a certain amount of um, internal, intrinsic motivation. And let's
Mm-hmm.
say a, a disregard, a healthy disregard for, you know, the superficial perceptions people will have about your work and you on the outside. So if you just live for accolades and kind of cheap compliments, that can only get you so far as a leader
Yeah.
in any realm, because you have to be able to see past the near term, the quick and easy wins, and to build a successful organization of any kind or lead a team successfully in the long term will require some tough decisions that may, you know, lead to some resistance early on. So I think if you can't overcome that, then yes, you will have a tough time.
Yeah. So I would add to that then. So you want to build a new business. You want to help a small town recover from decades of abandonment by the economy. All of that. You have to have, I know it's an used word, but you have to have a passion for something. And that passion has to be aligned with what you could see possibly ahead, if only. And so you start a business or you win a war, but you have to believe in that there's something about that unseen future. Talk about unseen leaders. So maybe there's your connection. Unseen
Yeah,
leaders
yeah.
uh,
And
can
and
see
you
the
know,
unseen future, and then they talk about it and they act on it, and eventually it becomes seen.
exactly, exactly. And as we talk about it here, just to push this idea a bit farther, I think it helps to have a passion. I don't know if it's necessary, and I'll tell you why. I think that the key ingredient is the willingness to work really hard, to learn, to kind of obsess about something. Now, if you're passionate about that thing, that becomes much easier,
Yeah,
because
it's
then
true.
you just do it. But I think there's enough examples too of leaders who um, they may not have been passionate about a certain aspect of what they were doing, but knew enough to say, I really need to master this before I can make good decisions here. And they were willing to put in the work.
Yeah,
And so passion helps, but I don't know if it's always necessary. The other
yeah,
side that you mentioned, of course, that ties in closely with passion is this vision and the ability to imagine a future that nobody else can, and then drawing that line back to the present and saying, we can get there. And in order for us to do so, this is what I'm going to have to do, and this is what we're going to have to do. And that's, of course, is a fantastic competency to have. And I could
yeah,
only wish that more of us did. I don't
yeah,
know that I do
yeah.
myself.
Well, it's easy to say it. I can say, "Oh yeah, I have all those visions," but really, the point is that I feel that in a business school, uh, however it's defined and accredited, developing that particular competency has to be one of the primary foci of the whole school.
Agreed. Yeah.
Because what about business is about the past? No, I'm speaking to a historian. It's a past. The money has been lost or made, people hired or let go, all of that. And if you cannot bring to customers in the market something that next they will want from you, the business is gone.
Yeah.
These
Yeah.
days, like that. So uh, we who teach, I think that humans are capable of having these visions. It's just, are they able to codify them and express them? And that's, again, if we teach students to memorize what's in the book and do little else to stimulate that kind of imagination or imagining in a business school, what we're telling them is you're a student of business history.
Yep. Yep.
And you are in a way, but you're not, it's not your whole subject.
Sure.
How do you work with your own learners in regard to that ability to look at the
Well,
unseen future and not be scared by it?
I mean, what you how you just characterized, your mission and vision for teaching and how business schools should function, that definitely resonates with me. I mean, I
Mm.
also think it it's our job as a business school to, not teach individual skills. Of course, we have to do that as well. You have to, learn
Mm.
certain accounting techniques and everything else.
Mhm.
But it's about a mindset and about
Mhm.
making people believe and motivated and ready to put something new into practice. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that makes teaching at a business school so exciting. I feel like I'm much closer to practice than just purely theory, which is what my teaching at more traditional universities farther back in my career was like, which of course has a lot of value as well. For me personally, it is more fun to be a bit closer to that practice. I know that what I teach to some extent will be put into action by the students I have the privilege of interacting with. And now to your second question there about business history and what role that might play. I mean, I think history can teach us a lot. I don't think it can teach us these kind of cheap, very easily one-to-one transferable lessons, so that because it happened like this in the past, it's going to happen like that again, and we need to decide exactly this way. So there's no easy lessons from history. But I think one of the things that history can help students and managers in general is to understand and appreciate that people have been in their shoes before.
Yeah.
So I mean, just take net. I was just reading Aaron Meyer's great book about Netflix the other day, and
Yeah.
No Rules Rules, I believe it's called. And the thing about Netflix is, you know, it's not an old company at this point, but today it's a given. We all streaming, we take it for granted. Of
Mhm.
course, they're competing for the Oscars and everything else. Why not? But just 2 decades ago, it was unimaginable.
Yeah, here's a
And
little envelope with a disc in it.
exactly,
Which,
exactly.
if you didn't mail it back, here's the penalty.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And that was a great innovation in its own right as
It
well.
was.
At the DVDs at
It
home.
shook blot. It broke Blockbuster. So
No,
you're right
and
about history in that regard, because if we can see uh, where the status quo in one particular application of an industry costs the future of a company or a whole industry for that matter, with something that was more innovative. And therefore, what it did, Netflix is a great one to look at. I have to read that book, is that it brought instant gratification to the household.
yeah,
I don't have to go out to Blockbuster, blah, blah, blah. And it was instant. And it wasn't even, oh, I have to remember to send this envelope back, or there's a fine, or I won't get it was instant. And of course, we've conditioned a population in the world, at least the people who have income, to expect that
yeah,
from every
yeah,
source, right?
yeah.
I want,
That's right.
I
And
want food. But I want it delivered, and I want it within an hour, and I want it to be hot. And it's not just pizza. I want a full meal. You know,
you
it's come on.
you are right. And I think in that sense, as much as I admire Netflix as a company, they are or were part of creating a relationship to technology that you know where the jury's still out, where I think future historians might say this was a
Mm.
very unhealthy development, especially for adolescents. I've kids
Yeah,
myself now, and it's tough with smartphones and everything else. They
yeah,
are really made in a way so that you can't get them out of your hands. And that's a lot for a young brain to be um, subjected to. But
Yes, yes.
no, the other, I mean, there's these examples with Netflix and other companies where we can just see how tenuous and how much of a stretch it was for these founders. Um, and now they put it into practice and we all take it for granted. The other thing that I really appreciate about the power of history is that um, there's this tendency now to describe the present moment as uniquely disruptive, as uniquely uncertain. There's the term VUCA that's
Mhm.
become very popular in the last decade. And I would suggest, if we look historically, there have been many periods with a lot of uncertainty where leaders had to make decisions without having access to all the relevant information, without fully understanding who the actors were in their
Mhm.
ecosystem, et cetera. And we can take some comfort in that as well, and I think draw some lessons from that as well. That sure, the technology we have now, the certain geopolitical realities are unique today, just like they're unique in any period in history.
Mm.
But living through an uncertain time is not something that's new for us.
Peter Vale, in one of our podcast conversations, said, he said, I'm often asked uh, how to identify leadership. And my answer is look where change is happening, to your point about disruption. If you don't see leadership happening around the change, then look again.
I love that. That's great.
We all need some place to put the pin, on the map and then see what's around it. And so change. And if you're looking at the larger picture of the scene leaders, the ones that we attribute these changes to, um, you have to look to see all of the streams of things that changed or had to be changed, change them or had to be changed before they could even have that moment in the spotlight. So, what do you think about that notion of look for the change and you'll find a leader, as far as finding the unseen part?
I like it. I'd have to, I
I
need
mean,
some
it's
time to
almost, he
think.
didn't, he'd said a lot more about it, but he
Yeah,
said
yeah.
that to give us a place to start.
It rings true. I'd have to think about it more before I would sign off on it as, a
I
general
can't get
truth,
you to
let's
do that
say.
on the
Yeah.
podcast. No, I get it.
I'll get back to you. No, I mean, I think he was definitely onto something, right? That where things are changing, either it will require a leader to help steer the people who are affected by that change, or
Yes.
there is a leader who is affecting that change, or
Right.
both. So
Right.
I agree that if there's change, there's a need for leadership. And
Mm-hmm.
again, the one who is making the most noise, shouting the loudest, might not be the one who is actually doing the most to facilitate a positive change or a healthy change for the organization or the team involved.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I I suspect in some scenarios the truly gifted leaders are ensuring stability. I don't mean to sound overly conservative here because I think
Mm-hmm.
part of humanity, we change, we evolve, we always have, for better or worse. The technologies we use, how we relate to each other, our political systems. Um, but I do think there are also moments where the right decision is to put the brakes on change, to be a
Sure.
bit more conservative. And so I wonder if in such moments we don't recognize the leader then because there's no obvious change that signals there's something big going on here.
Oh, Peter would love to have this conversation. I mean, he would just love it because what he would probably say is that the the leading up to that moment took a lot of risk taking and effort and communication. Uh, so that if you find the status quo at that moment being held, you might say, okay, the change is over. great. Let's move on. And what it really he'll say, because of the belief that he had and I share, and probably you do too, is that everything is always in a state of flow. But
Yeah.
what you see in that moment is people making the concerted effort to hold things together the way they are, recognizing that that's only going to last so long. And then they've got to be ready to flex and go again. And my point there is, in terms of leaders, it's not a leader who's holding it. It's a group of people exerting that energy to hold, which
Yeah.
in itself is different than just maintaining. And then someone else within that scenario might become the next person to say, okay, let go, everyone. Oh, no, we can't let go. And on it goes again. And so, and again, that's the excitement of, the old thing, what's management, what's leadership? How are they the same? How are they different? Peter called them managerial leaders. In other words, it's
Oh, I
one
like
word
that.
with two, it's one thought with two words, managerial leaders. So that holding part, we could call the managing part. The leading part, we could say it's the breakthrough, break out, and keep going part. But without both, of course, it's all just floundering around seeing what sticks. And yet holding, which I'm sure the blockbuster people did up until the last minute, up
Yeah.
to the last late fee before
Right.
they accepted it. I look down my road as I go down through our shopping lane, and I look at the building that used to be Blockbusters. I can't even say that word. And it's now a walk-in health center, which I guess is doing the Lord's work. But
Yeah.
I'm amused because that place, I saw people here in Connecticut winters slogging in through the ice and slush, dragging that bag of videos that they used on the weekend and feeling, oh, and then getting there and the guy looks in and checks it in and says, "Oh, sorry, Mr. Fearon, you owe $15." $15. I mean,
A
that was
lot of money.
awful. So they
Yeah.
held and they didn't think of ultimately the well-being of their own consumer.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
again what, to me,
No, that's
where it all gets changed around for business is, and I know it's like another cliche, watch the customer carefully and how they're living, how they're breathing, how they're, and not just from a data set. Listen to the people who have direct contact with your customers. Even if you're a massive company, ask the guy at the desk in that old Blockbusters what he knew well in advance of the senior leadership and the board.
no doubt. Yeah.
And you'd see unseen leading going on.
That's
Let
right.
me add another thing about that poor guy. Unheard leaders.
Exactly. Yes. No,
Yeah,
I
why
think
didn't they listen to me? I wrote a whole book about that, by the way. It's right here. It's called Inside Knowledge. It's a novel that I wrote back when Peter was still writing, and it's about a call center operator named Dana Gilbert. And she had a headset, and like you, and she was in a business to business distribution company. So when she heard from the buyers of various businesses that were buying their product, it was through her ears and into her mind. And then she would say what she learned. She was replaced, along with her others, by the early days, as 2006, by a system that was going to cut out the conversation altogether. Purchasing agent, click, click, click,
yeah.
boom, it's ordered. Wonderful. But what she was learning in the meantime were the symptoms of how those businesses were going to be doing next quarter and 10 quarters out. And she was
Yeah.
very smart, even though she didn't finish her college. She was working on it. And she wasn't listened to. She was unheard. So I wrote a whole book about my hero,
That's
Dana
brilliant.
Gilbert.
I definitely need to read that. And I think
Well,
it brings us
I got to
back.
redigitize it because it went
Okay,
out of
good.
print. But my current publisher, my library, is going to redigitize it, because nowadays still have the same cause as I'm watching the clock, but the same cause is, and that's one of the many reasons I was intrigued by your title, is I worked with for thousands of students over the 50 years that I was in various undergraduate programs. And there was hardly one that I wouldn't want to have had to be listened to when they observed
Yeah.
something that no one else was seeing.
Yeah.
And yet I would say to them, okay, now that's only half the battle. The other half is become articulate. So
Yep.
I have you doing a lot of speaking with each other and in your teams. Oh, and by the way, part of being articulate is being able to write coherently and quickly. Sometimes lovely to be edited and reviewed, but mainly you got to pound that out right now. And back then it was an email. Now it's a text. You can run a whole company with text. But anyway, the point is, you don't let yourself be obscured. And it doesn't just mean have a profile on LinkedIn, which I asked them all to do back when LinkedIn was invented. One of the very first times I saw it, I said, okay, everyone, all my students, you must create a LinkedIn profile. One kid said, but I don't have a profile yet. I said, oh, really? True.
Time to start working on your profile.
Then exactly, live a profile and have one. But on the other hand, find out how many people would be intrigued that your profile says captain of the baseball team, which is all you've accomplished so far. But how long did it take you to become such a good baseball player and a leader that you could be the captain of our baseball team?
Yeah. I was just going to say that's
damn
that's
right.
An
From Little League on, man.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a lot of swings at the bat.
I really appreciate that you took the effort to, motivate and teach your students to be better at becoming seen and heard. And I am fairly certain that many of them benefited directly from that advice and that push from you. And it's interesting you say this, because one of the questions I often get, so I've been speaking a lot also at companies and other places about my book. And, I essentially just come to the conclusion that, as I term it, we celebrate the wrong leaders. We celebrate the loud, usually guys who make the most noise, but very often they were not the most influential ones. And so the question then always comes, well, what should I do if I'm not such a loud person, or if I'm a woman and I don't,
or an introvert,
behave? I'm an introvert, exactly. I don't behave like our stereotypical leader does. I don't behave like a British polar explorer, who's on stage waving his arms around. And I don't always have a good answer, because part of me says, well, you have to learn how to make more noise. You have to learn how to be heard. On the other hand, I would wish for our organizations to become better at recognizing leaders who don't look like our stereotypical leaders.
That's the key. That's the key. You can only do so much as an individual in an organization to make enough difference to be noticed. But nowadays, this new generation, as I'm following the trends, will bring themselves into the context of a particular company, and they'll get a sense almost immediately whether that organization is set up for their success, as well as the success of the whole company and ultimately the customer. They'll pick up on that right away. And my advice would be, start looking around. Because if you're not where you can matter, and I don't, not ego, just you want to make a difference. You see the business, you understand it, you've got the skills, and you're not allowed to have the chance to flex. Back in my day, we would say to that young person, well, 15 years from now, you may even become a senior leader of a team. Imagine 15 years from now. And so up until that point, you were supposed to keep yourself out of trouble.
Yep.
It's just different now. And do you see that too?
Absolutely.
For the young people? I mean, find the context where they can thrive as early on as possible in their work career.
I do, and I think the in an ideal situation, they land at such an organization or they have the flexibility to leave if they're not in the right place. I think that's not, unfortunately, that's not always the case.
No,
And,
it's quite
you know,
rare,
yeah.
unfortunately.
So then,
Yeah,
we get in this difficult position where, I don't know, should I encourage a student or a former student to stay in a job that's where they are not being recognized for who they are and what they can really contribute for the sake of building their resume? That feels like the wrong advice to give. On the other hand, you know, having nothing to do at all is probably not good either. So that's a really tricky one, I have to say. And
yeah,
there, my appeal is really for um, the senior management in general to start recognizing leadership in the quieter corners of your team. Start looking more broadly at leadership. Not all leaders look the same. They don't all talk the same. And depending on the challenge at hand, they will, a good leader would have behaved or will behave differently. And until
yeah,
we start to recognize that, I think there will be a lot of organizations that suffer. And interestingly, again, uh, these are conclusions that I came to through my work as a historian, but there's a lot of more recent studies in organizational psychology. There's, for example, a famous study out of Binghamton, Neil McLaren, that documented that whoever spoke the most in a group was perceived to be the most influential leader of that group. It didn't matter what they said, right? So there's a lot of evidence for this, that we have a faulty filter, if you will, our filter for picking out who has the most leadership potential or who was the most influential in any given scenario is not functioning the way it should. And
yeah,
it's in our best interest to correct that.
yeah. Well, that's a great note for us to end this conversation, Martin Gutmann, but I hope it's certainly not the last one. Even if I don't record it, I want to talk to you and learn with you. You're a terrific interlocutor, to use a very fancy word. And I commend you for the book, but also what you're going to be doing next. Last question before we go. What are you working on now? I heard your wife
I
sigh in the other room, by the way, when she heard that question. Oh, no,
no,
no.
that was
I'm kidding.
no. I think I'm a happier and healthier person when I'm working on a project I'm passionate about. So I think if my wife were listening, which she is not, she would probably say, go for it, Martin. Work on
Yeah,
whatever project you're passionate about.
yeah,
But yeah, it always comes at a cost, right? We've got 3 kids. She also has a very busy and impactful career. So we got to juggle all these things.
yeah.
So what am I working on next? Well, it's something I'm debating right now. I'm still trying to spread the message about the unseen leader. I'm doing this podcast, which is absolute pleasure. So let's keep the conversation going.
Hmm.
But lots of other talks as well. And as that's starting to, I wouldn't say fizzle out, but become less, of my daily business, the question is what's next? And
Hmm.
I have 2 or 3 book ideas. I'm talking to a lot of people to see what might make the most sense to work on next, but I haven't committed to one yet. And until I do, I'm not sure I want to talk about it publicly either yet. So
That's all
I'll keep
right.
you in suspense once again.
That's great. That's great. And the the author's brain itch.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
It is, and you can't scratch it with your fingers. But it's in one more word about Peter. When he gave a legacy talk to the Organizational Behavior Teaching Society, Scott Allen may have been there. It was about 11 years ago now, and you know, he was at that point had every reason to say, "I'm done and I'm done." But he said, there are 3 things. It's funny. There are 3 things that I just can't get out of my head that I really want to think about and say something about. Right? He wanted his voice to be heard. And one of the 3 was practice. And the
Oh,
other two
nice.
was co-inquiry, and I can't remember the other one because he said, of the three, practice is the one that's on my mind the most because it's bothered me the most that as a professor, as an academic, we were very, very enamored with each other's ability to work theory, but we
Right.
rarely spoke about its impact on practice. And we rarely drew our inspiration from practice. So that's what I want to write about. And so for 11 more years, every minute he could, he wrote about it. And now it's called On Practice as a Way of Being. So
I love it. Well, I'm glad he chose that of the three, and I'm
He
glad
did,
you've carried. I'm glad you've carried on that work. So
thank you
hats
so
off.
much. All right, Martin.
It was a pleasure.
Stay well.
You too, Dave. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Automatic, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again. Oh, and one more thing. Please check out our webpage at enactionresearch.info.